In today's tricky topic video, we are learning about the topic of genetic crosses, and we're going to look at inheritance of characteristics. By the end of today's video, you'll be able to describe the terms heterozygous, homozygous, allele, dominant, and recessive. You'll be able to identify the phenotype and genotype in different scenarios, and you'll be able to predict the probability of a genetic characteristic being inherited by using Punnett squares. At various points in this video, there'll be opportunities for you to pause and complete some questions, so make sure you have a pen and paper with you. First of all, we're going to start by learning how to describe the terms heterozygous, homozygous allele, dominant and recessive. So in a normal adult body cell, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 chromosomes overall. For each pair of chromosomes, we inherit one from our mother and one from our father. Chromosomes contain genes, which are short sections of DNA which provide the instructions for a particular characteristic of the body. Our chromosomes pair up based on what genes they carry, means that we effectively have 2 copies of every single gene. Throughout this lesson, we're going to use the example of a pair of chromosomes, each of which carries a copy of the gene for eye colour. Each gene exists in several different versions, which we call alleles. So alleles are different versions of the same gene. We inherit one allele from our mother, and we can inherit a different or the same allele from our father. If a person has 2 different alleles, we say they are heterozygous, with hetero meaning different. If they have 2 copies of the same allele, we say they are homozygous, homo meaning the same. If you've noticed that some people have different eye colours to their parents, or 2 parents with different eye colours, this is as a result of some alleles being dominant and some alleles being recessive. A dominant allele will always be expressed. It will always show up in the characteristic, even if there's only one allele. If an allele is recessive, then there must be 2 of them present in order for it to be expressed. The pair of alleles that you inherit from your parents is called your genotype, and in this session we're going to use the letter B to represent eye colour, with the capital B representing the dominant eye colour brown and the lowercase b representing the recessive eye colour allele blue. The name for these alleles is our genotype, e.g. big B, little b, or little b, whereas the characteristic that you have, e.g. blue eyes or brown eyes, is known as the phenotype. In this case, we have lowercase b, which is a homozygous recessive trait, which would result in blue eyes. We have a capital B and a lowercase b, which would be a heterozygous trait, but because the brown eye colour is dominant, we would have brown eyes. And in the final case, we have homozygous dominant, both alleles, and so we would have brown eyes again. So we're going to have some questions now. For each question, pause the video, decide the answer, and when you're ready to check your work, press play again. You can now pause for question 1. Okay, so a different version of a gene is called an allele. Pause again and play when you're ready to check your work. Having 2 different alleles is called heterozygous because hetero means different. Pause again and start again when you're ready to check your answer. Someone with the genotype capital B lowercase b would be heterozygous because they're 2 different alleles. Pause the video again and press play when you're ready to start. Okay, in this case, if they only possess one allele, but that allele is expressed in the phenotype, in the characteristic, it must be dominant. Pause the video again and press play when you're ready to check your answer. So in this case, if a mouse has white fur, it must have both copies of the recessive allele, because that's the only way in which we have a recessive allele expressed. Now we're going to move on to being able to identify the phenotype and genotype in different scenarios. For this question, or this series of 7 questions, you need to read the key. We're going to look at 3 different traits. We're going to look at eye colour, freckles, and cystic fibrosis, each represented by a different letter. And the key tells you which trait is dominant and which trait is recessive. For the first 5 questions, you're going to use the genotype, or the alleles, to identify what the phenotype, or characteristic, would be. For questions 6 and 7, you have been given the phenotype, the characteristic, and you need to see if you can identify what the genotype is. Pause the video now and press play again when you're ready to check your responses. You can now review your work using the answers on the screen to see if you managed to identify the 5 different phenotypes or characteristics and the 2 different genotypes. Pause the video now and press play again when you're ready to move on. The final section of this tricky topic video is going to be predicting the probabilities that offspring have a certain characteristic by using Punnett squares. In this video, we're going to look at how to draw a Punnett square to represent the inheritance of eye colour. Throughout the video, we're going to represent the recessive allele with a lowercase b, and that is for a blue eye colour. And we're going to represent the dominant allele, which is a capital B, which is the brown eye colour. What we're going to do is we're going to look at parent phenotypes, so the parental phenotype, that's their characteristic, where we have one parent with brown eyes and one parent with blue eyes. Our parental genotypes, so that is the alleles that we have, is going to be homozygous dominant for our brown-eyed parent, and it's going to be homozygous recessive for our blue-eyed parent. In our Punnett square, we first draw out the grid. We need space to draw our parental alleles on either side, and we need space to draw our cross. I'm going to put our brown-eyed parent at the top, writing one allele in each box, and our blue-eyed parent down the side, writing one allele in each box again. To draw the Punnett square, I then look at each of my 4 squares in turn and match up what is in each row and column. So I take my dominant allele from the top, my recessive allele from the side, and I end up with a heterozygous individual. I do the same again for each of the other boxes. What I've now got is I've got all 4 offspring, or 100% of offspring, with a heterozygous set of alleles. Their genotype is heterozygous. Due to the fact that the brown eye allele is dominant, the capital B is dominant, that means I have 100% of my offspring will have brown eyes. In this video, we're In this video we are going to look at Punnett square inheritance, and I'm going to help you through a worked example. Again, in this example we are going to look at eye colour, and we're going to look at a recessive allele represented by a lowercase b, and that's going to represent our blue eye colour. We also have a capital B to represent our dominant allele, which is the eye colour brown. We're first of all going to look at our parental phenotypes, so that is the characteristic that they have, and in this case we're going to have two brown-eyed parents. We also need to know what their genotype is. In this case we're going to have one heterozygous parents with two different alleles, and we're going to have another heterozygous parent with two different alleles. What you need to do now is you need to draw out your Punnett square with space for parental alleles, and you need to carry out the cross. Pause the video now to see if you can do that independently. Okay, so the first step that you should have done was writing in your parental alleles at the top. So we have one heterozygous parent at the top and one heterozygous parent down the side. We then work through each of our boxes in turn, placing the crosses in the boxes. Here we have a homozygous dominant cross. Here we have a heterozygous cross. In this box it's another heterozygous cross, and in the final box it is homozygous recessive. I then need to identify what the phenotype would be for each of my offspring genotypes. In this first box I've got dominant brown eye colour allele, and so it's going to be brown. In these two boxes they're both heterozygous, so 2 and 3 are going to be brown, and in this final box I've got two recessive alleles, so I'm going to have blue. That means of the four possibilities, 3 of them, 3 out of 4, are brown, which means I am 75% brown, and my ratio is 3 to 1 brown to blue. If you are able to work through that Punnett square, in this video So there is now an opportunity for you to work through an example completely independently. What you can do is pause the video, and then you need to identify the parent phenotype, the parent genotype, draw your own Punnett square, and calculate the probabilities. Once you've done that, you can restart the video when you're ready to check your answer. Pause the video now. So what you should have realised is that the parent phenotype is grey, so that's their characteristic, okay? And we know that because we have two heterozygous parents, which would have that dominant allele, and so they would both be grey. For the Punnett square, you should have put your parental alleles at the top and at the side. You would have then carried out your cross, and for each of the possible offspring, you identify what their phenotype would be. Remembering that these are just probabilities, it's not necessarily that there would be 4 offspring, these are the probabilities overall in all offspring, and we end up with 75% of our offspring. The probabilities is that 75% will be grey and 25% will be white. The ratio will be 3 to 1 no matter how many offspring we have. You can now have another example where you need to carry out the same process as you did in the last example. Pause the video when you're ready and restart again when you want to check your work. So what you should have identified is that we've got one smooth P parent, okay, that's our heterozygous, and one wrinkled P parent. We know that it's heterozygous for the genotype for our smooth P, and for our wrinkled P plant, we know it must be homozygous recessive because that is the only way of expressing a recessive trait. In your Punnett square, you would have first identified your parental alleles at the top and at the side. You would have carried out your cross to look at the probabilities of each genotype and phenotype in your offspring, and you would have realised that 50% of offspring, there's a probability of 50% of the offspring being smooth and a probability of 50% of the offspring being wrinkled. The ratio expected would be 1 to 1. So we now reach the end of today's tricky topic video. You should now be able to describe the terms heterozygous, homozygous, allele, dominant and recessive. You'll be able to identify the phenotype and the genotype in different scenarios, and you'll be able to predict the probability of a genetic characteristic being inherited by using Punnett squares. Thanks for listening.